Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you that if you do feel so inclined, you can make yourselves available to all the features that YouTube has to offer, whether it be through Super Chat, Super Thanks, or Super Stickers. It is a huge support to me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole. You could also consider leaving tips and donations. Keep your questions and comments coming. They're always good. I love interacting with you guys through the chat. So if you feel so inclined, please consider doing that because it just makes this show that much more better. Your insight makes my insight and the content of the show so much more great, so keep doing that. Without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment of today's show. And this is another running back room of contention. We switch from the NFC to the AFC with this one. It's always been a huge debate surrounding this room, and it could be the X factor this year for this particular team because of the profile of their offense. There's not much excitement surrounding it, even though they have two QBs who might work out, one with a little bit more upside than the other in terms of long-term success. But the overarching sentiment when it comes to this offense is that it really does not have that many weapons. So the running back room is definitely going to be scrutinized very heavily as the season goes on. And that is the running back room of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And everyone seems to be talking about, is it going to be Najee Harris or Jaylen Warren? Well, I'm here to tell you that I think that the direction of this running back room is going in a way that could really help the Steelers. And here's why. Let's start off with both of these guys and kind of comparing them. So Jaylen Warren did have a hamstring injury last year, but he's expected to be ready for the season opener, and I think that at the end of the day, there's a lot of excitement surrounding him. Let's talk about the presumptive starter and Najee Harris a little bit more to start this conversation going. He had 569 snaps in 2023. He had, I believe, 1,335 yards, and I think that ultimately you would take that. But let's consider this. In a smaller sample size, Warren had 519 snaps, 784 yards, kind of a third down change of pace back, but with that, he had 61 receptions on 74 targets for 370 yards. So make of that what you will. I think that in a smaller sample size, it would be more appealing for you to look at Jaylen Warren. But at the end of the day, Najee Harris is kind of one of those bulk backs in that he gets a lot of touches, maybe a little bit more production in the long run, but in terms of the upside of this offense and the efficiency that I might want to use early on in the season, Jaylen Warren could be their guy. And even though Najee Harris has a nice little profile in terms of PPR, 228.6 PPR fantasy points last year and ranked second in the league in broken tackles, the reason why I'm so high on Jaylen Warren is because of the fact that Najee Harris get a little bit more touches in the open field. Jaylen Warren might be the guy to just finish the job. And in situational football, where the Steelers might need that change of pace, might need a guy, should Russell Wilson, who was named the starter, kind of get into this rut, Jaylen Warren just seems like the guy to get him out of it because of his explosiveness and his abilities in the receiving game. But the biggest caveat surrounding the Steelers offense, as we get another update here, picking 10th in a 12-team league, says tap to learn, looking at A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, or Jonathan Taylor. Which one do you like? Well, let me be clear here. In a 12-team league, all of these guys kind of project as high second-round players. There may be some guys who might fall to you at 10, but I think it is apt to include some of these guys. That being said, I think that Jonathan Taylor makes the most sense, especially if the way your draft is going leans more wide receiver heavy. Say there's a big cluster of wide receivers after McCaffrey's and Halls are gone that go at least say 5 through 8 or so. I think it would set the precedent to pick a Jonathan Taylor to really set the standard that you kind of want to steer the direction of the draft, even though you have a lower draft pick. So zig where there's zag is kind of what I'm saying. Even though A.J. Brown and Garrett Wilson would be apt picks in the latter half of the first round, getting into the early stages of the second round. So Jonathan Taylor would be my pick there. A lot of upside with him. We talked about him a lot on the show. In that Colts offense, probably going to be a little bit more expected to carry the load should Anthony Richardson take a while to transition and get back into the starting QB in the NFL mindset. So I like that pick. But getting back to the Steelers as a whole, I think the main caveat with them, as I was saying before the comment, is that it's not the running backs. It's the offensive coordinator. And we all know what Arthur Smith does with his running backs, if he uses them to any effect at all. So I'm not criticizing what Arthur Smith is going to do with this offense, but he's not the most appealing when it comes to incorporating running backs in nice ways. That being said, I like the fact that in Atlanta, he did recognize that Tyler Algier had something to offer. So when I compare what he did in Atlanta with what he did in Pittsburgh, maybe that kind of favors Najee Harris a little bit, because Algier is more on the ground and pound guy, and that's what I think of Harris at this current moment in time. Then you have a guy like Bijan, who he didn't use as much, but when he did use him, it was used to great effect. Got a lot of scrimmage yards out of him. He did use him very much so in the receiving game. So I think my prediction for this running back room will be that Harris will get the bulk of the carries. But Warren is more of a weapon in the receiving game. That being said, I still think in the open field, Najee Harris could get some receiving looks as well, especially if you want to shorten the passes for Russell Wilson in this offense, because I think that the idea of this Pittsburgh Steelers offense kind of simplifying things really leads to Russell Wilson as well. I think what he did in Denver was too much. I think that in the second season in Denver, where he played a little bit more freely, kind of alluded to the fact that he wants to continue doing that, but as he gets older, I think that the running ability is going to get a little bit lost to the wayside here. And in this offense, there could be some mouths to feed that, should he not, then Mike Tomlin might look for Justin Fields. It might be cliche because Justin Fields also brings a dual threat ability. But I think the reason why Mike Tomlin went with Russell Wilson is A, he feels like the safer pick at this point, and B, he does definitely bring a little bit more arm talent to the position. And so, seeing as to how this running back room has kind of this weird opportunity to develop into pass catchers that plays into what Najee Harris can then take with him in terms of finding a more open space. But I still think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to Russell Wilson himself being able to diagnose how these running backs are playing and just going with the hot hand here. And the hot hand may tend to be Jaylen Warren, especially if they put together more red zone drives. As Tactulern says, I have either of these guys that are on my bench and maybe a desperation flex. I completely agree with that sentiment. I think that in a deeper PPR league, Warren might make a little bit more sense, but at the end of the day, the contention surrounding this Steelers running back room stems from the fact that they may have to get desperate to really incorporate both of these guys' versatilities into this offense. And with Arthur Smith and what he brings, I don't necessarily see it as much. But If anything, I think in the receiving game they could really help. That being said, if you start Najee Harris over Jaylen Warren, you're going to see more stagnation in terms of ground and pound style. And I don't necessarily think the Steelers want to be that. So I completely agree with that sentiment, tap to learn. But to kind of sum up why I'm bringing up the Steelers running back room, it's mainly because in that AFC and especially the AFC North landscape, when you have two guys who are not necessarily quote-unquote committee guys, they have these roles, it's going to come down to the logistics of the offensive setup. And I know that it's going to be weird, especially with Pittsburgh, considering the fact that they're not necessarily known for the offensive side of the ball. But it's going to come down to how Arthur Smith really sees these two running backs and how he utilizes them. That's all I can really say. I don't necessarily think they're fantasy studs. They could represent upside in deep leagues, and they may be some desperation flexes or streams like Tap to Learn says. But don't count on them, really having settled roles that you can rely upon week in, week out. So, that's my ultimate diagnosis of them. I think Najee Harris will start, but I think at the end of the day, if I'm looking towards the future, Jaylen Warren could be an appealing guy a couple years down the road, should he start to get a little bit more starting touches. But that should just about do it. Thank you for the comments for the segment. Coming up next, we go to another running back room that I really like, and I think has a lot more upside than the two that I mentioned in terms of how these two guys pan out. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about them as well.
Looking for your daily